Somewhere in the late 1990s, James Cameron was openly talking about Alita Battle Angel, like it was going to be his next movie after Titanic. And back then, when Cameron said he was making something, people usually believed him. This was the guy behind the Terminator and Aliens, casually explaining how his next sci-fi epic was going to completely blow audiences away. But somewhere in the mid-2000s, Cameron slowly stopped pretending Alita was actually happening, because out of nowhere came something called Project 880, which later evolved into a small independent art film known as Avatar. A lot of people blame Cameron's very first movie, Piranha 2: The Spawning, for all of this. Apparently that movie gave him a lifelong addiction to water. Ever since then, James Cameron has spent an almost concerning amount of time either underwater or thinking about being underwater. Once Titanic became the highest grossing movie in history and Hollywood basically crowned him King of Earth, Cameron immediately decided the logical next step was to go explore the Mariana Trench, which he actually did. Then came documentaries and expeditions like Expedition Bismarck, Ghosts of the Abyss, Aliens of the Deep, Volcanoes of the Deep Sea, and Last Mysteries of the Titanic. All of them had one thing in common: a truly unreasonable amount of water. At this point, Cameron was basically legally required to be near the ocean at all times. So Alita never really stood a chance. And by the time Alita Battle Angel finally made it to theaters in 2019, it was being directed by somebody else entirely. And honestly, no matter what the marketing tried to tell people, the version of Alita that hit theaters probably had very little in common with the movie James Cameron originally imagined. Alita's journey actually started back in the mid-1990s. At the time, James Cameron was trying to get a Spider-Man movie off the ground with Arnold Schwarzenegger playing Dr. Octopus, which already sounds insane. But the bigger problem was the budget. Cameron's version of Spider-Man was supposedly so expensive it could have funded 2 Titanic movies, and probably another Terminator movie on top of that. And the technology back then simply couldn't keep up with whatever was happening inside Cameron's brain. Today, if you told a studio that James Cameron wanted to make Spider-Man with Schwarzenegger attached, they'd probably hand him $400 million before he even finished the sentence. But in the mid-90s, comic book movies were still bombing constantly, and studios were nowhere near ready to gamble that kind of money on superheroes. So Cameron started looking for another giant sci-fi project instead. And according to the story, the idea came from his longtime friend, Guillermo del Toro. Yes, the director of Mimic and Hellboy apparently introduced Cameron to the manga that would eventually become Alita. Cameron immediately fell in love with it and started developing the project almost obsessively. He reportedly wrote around 1,000 pages of notes, ideas, concept art, and world-building details, which sounds less like pre-production and more like somebody building an entire religion. But unlike Spider-Man, nobody actually rejected Alita. Cameron shelved it himself because he decided the technology of the 90s simply wasn't advanced enough to pull it off properly. And then another idea suddenly showed up: a giant ship hitting an iceberg in the middle of the Atlantic. Somehow, that became the easier movie to make. In 1999, after the success of Titanic, 20th Century Fox bought the rights to Alita at Cameron's request and reportedly agreed to a $200 million budget. Cameron wanted to make a serious, dark cyberpunk epic. And yes, apparently his original vision was much closer to hard R-rated sci-fi than what audiences eventually got. By the mid-2000s, he believed the technology would finally be ready, but then Cameron disappeared underwater again for several years, and right after that came Avatar. And once Avatar happened, Alita quietly got shoved back into a drawer yet again. Right after Avatar became the biggest movie in history, Cameron once again announced that he was finally returning to Battle Angel. In 2010, producer John Landau said Cameron had officially started working on Alita and that it would become his next movie. Now, to be fair, James Cameron is one of the most powerful directors in Hollywood, but even he probably wasn't getting unlimited money for a brand new sci-fi franchise nobody outside manga fans really knew. Avatar sequels were a different story entirely. Studios would have financed Avatar 7 if Cameron asked nicely, because at that point they weren't funding movies anymore, they were funding a money printing machine. But Alita was riskier, especially because Cameron once wanted the movie to have an R rating. And eventually Cameron made the very difficult decision to direct somewhere between 3 and 47 Avatar sequels instead. So once again, Alita went right back onto the shelf. Then in 2016, the project suddenly came back to life when Robert Rodriguez was hired to direct it. Yes, The guy behind Spy Kids and The Adventures of Shark Boy and Lava Girl was now directing James Cameron's dark cyberpunk passion project. Cameron personally approved Rodriguez for the job, and according to most official stories, he was actually the one who chose him. Cameron apparently wanted somebody experienced with 3D filmmaking, and Rodriguez was technically qualified because of Spy Kids 3D Game Over, which is both hilarious and somehow completely true. From that point on, Rodriguez handled most of the production himself, although official sources still insist Cameron remained heavily involved behind the scenes and occasionally stepped in with ideas. Rodriguez inherited Cameron's original screenplay, later revised by Alita Kalogridis, whose previous credits included Alexander, Pathfinder, Shutter Island, and the cinematic war crime known as Terminator Genisys. Rodriguez also received around 600 pages of additional Cameron notes and world-building material. And according to Rodriguez, Cameron almost handed over another 400 pages before deciding maybe that was slightly excessive. Supposedly, those missing pages mostly focused on future sequels because Cameron originally envisioned Alita as at least a trilogy. Rodriguez later claimed he barely changed the script at all, trimming it from around 130 pages down to 125 before production officially moved forward. Casting the lead actress actually happened pretty fast. 4 names reportedly made it to the final round: Rosa Salazar, Zendaya, Micah Monroe, and Bella Thorne. Rodriguez eventually picked Rosa Salazar because she impressed him the most. And somewhere around this point, another very recognizable filmmaker suddenly entered the story. Apparently, Tarantino personally suggested casting Christoph Waltz in the movie because, according to him, Rodriguez simply wasn't going to find anyone better. Meanwhile, James Cameron continued publicly insisting he was helping Rodriguez however he could. Although Cameron also admitted in one interview that he visited the set exactly once before deciding he should probably never come back. According to Cameron, watching another director work is basically torture for him. He said that the second he stepped onto the Alita set, he immediately wanted to start changing everything. So instead, he wisely chose to leave before becoming a problem. Surprisingly, the actual shoot went pretty smoothly. Rodriguez finished filming in less than 4 months, which feels almost illegal for a giant CGI-heavy sci-fi movie like this. There were no major production disasters, no famous behind-the-scenes meltdowns, and no legendary test screening horror stories either. But there were several release delays, which usually means somebody in a studio office started sweating aggressively. Originally, Alita was supposed to hit theaters in the summer of 2018. Jurassic World Fallen Kingdom was coming out around the same time, and the previous Jurassic World had casually made $1.5 billion worldwide. So competing against giant killer dinosaurs probably wasn't the smartest idea. Officially though, the delay was blamed on visual effects work. The movie then moved to December 2018, where things somehow got even worse. Now it had to compete with Aquaman and Bumblebee, and when your expensive cyberpunk movie gets scared of Bumblebee, that's usually not a fantastic sign. So Alita moved again, this time to early 2019. And naturally, once the second delay happened, the internet immediately started treating the movie like an incoming disaster. Suddenly, everybody was convinced the film was doomed. There's also one genuinely funny detail here. When the first teaser trailer dropped, the internet absolutely lost its mind over Alita's giant CGI eyes. People were deeply uncomfortable. Some viewers looked at her face like they'd accidentally opened a cursed image. But instead of completely redesigning the character, Cameron apparently suggested making a relatively small adjustment to the iris. And somehow that actually worked. By the second trailer, people had mostly stopped complaining about the eyes. This is one of the most miraculous visual effects recoveries Hollywood has ever pulled off in public. And unlike the rest of this movie's production history, they somehow fixed that problem without delaying the release another 6 months. Eventually, the $170 million movie finally reached theaters in February 2019. Domestically, the movie didn't exactly explode at the box office. In North America, Alita earned only about $85 million total. International markets added another $319 million, which sounds decent at first glance. But there was one problem. Around $130 million of that came from China, where studios only keep a relatively small percentage of the revenue. So once you actually start doing the math, the numbers suddenly become a lot less impressive. Depending on the estimates, the studio probably got back something like $160 to $170 million from the theatrical run itself, which still left the movie's massive marketing budget buried somewhere at the bottom of the ocean, next to James Cameron. Home media sales didn't exactly save the situation either. Physical sales reportedly brought in around 23 million, which is surprisingly weak for a visually massive sci-fi blockbuster, especially when the much cheaper John Wick Chapter 3 made around 60 million in the exact same category that very year. Sure, you could argue that maybe Alita secretly became a giant streaming success behind the scenes, but honestly, there's very little evidence suggesting that happened, which explains why the heavily teased sequel never officially moved forward. And then things got even worse for Alita when the Walt Disney Company bought Fox. Disney already owned Star Wars, Marvel, and about half the entertainment industry. From Disney's perspective, trying to build a franchise out of a movie that barely crawled to 400 million worldwide probably didn't seem exciting, especially when the first film already struggled financially and the sequel carried a very real chance of losing even more money. So officially, Alita kind of entered development limbo. But surprisingly, the story still isn't completely dead. Over the years, Alita built a genuinely passionate fanbase that continues to bombard Disney with demands for a sequel. Both James Cameron and Robert Rodriguez regularly say they still want to continue the story. In multiple interviews over the last few years, they've talked about ideas for sequels and even a potential trilogy. Disney still hasn't officially greenlit anything, but the project also hasn't been fully buried yet either. So, at this point, Alita 2 feels less like a canceled movie and more like one of those projects Hollywood keeps leaving in a drawer until somebody suddenly remembers it exists again. That was Frameback. Subscribe for more rewinds and see you on the next one.